Good morning. We're back at Senate Judiciary dealing with Act 201 from 1988, which was the so-called Raise the Age bill. And the next issue that we're next subject on our agenda is the status of what has been done. There was a very lengthy implementation report provided on November 1, 2019. I will be the first to admit that I have not read the entire report, but I have gone over the executive summary several times and other sections of the report. But I think the report itself is like 200 some odd pages. So it's very thorough. And we thought it would be a good idea for us to get a sense from Commissioner Brown, the Department of Children and Families, and Deputy Commissioner Radke, and Tyler Allen, where we're at in terms of the implementation of Act 201 and what we haven't been done. We all have to recognize, when we passed Act 201 in 2018, could have foreseen COVID hitting right in the middle of when we were going to start the Raise the Age for 18-year-olds on July 1, 2020. So I appreciate you three of you coming here this morning. Commissioner, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to be here this morning. With me, we have Tyler Allen, who's the director of our Adolescent Services Unit. We also have Deputy Commissioner Erica Radke here as well. I appreciate your mentioning we went live with Raise the Age in Vermont during the middle of the pandemic. That has certainly presented challenges I don't think anyone foresaw. When Raise the Age was in its formation and planned for its implementation, it certainly created challenges in Raise the Age, but also just in general for our systems of care, and that we continue to experience some of those impacts and most likely will for a little bit down the road as well, just given the staffing challenges we're seeing across our programs and other services that we rely on to serve our youth and emerging adults. And so Erica and Tyler will kind of walk you through where we're at right now with that. But I also wanted to just take this opportunity. There's been a lot of on this issue in the media recently, regarding a pause or whatnot and whatever. And I just wanted to clarify for the committee that, we are still committed to Raise the Age and the path forward. We've certainly now have some real life experience with that. And we're looking forward to, along with other members of the administration, delving into that a little bit in more detail this afternoon. But I just wanted to emphasize that, we are still committed, but, we have learned some things in the last year implementing it, and that we, happy to discuss later this afternoon. And so with that in mind, we're happy to kind of transition into kind of the report and where we're at. And so Tyler, I would turn it over to you and Erica at this point, unless there's questions from the committee, Senator.
By the way, for the committee and those that may be watching outside, the implementation report is available on the committee website. Go ahead, either Tyler or Deputy Commissioner Radke.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. As the commission mentioned, we're here to talk about the implementation report for the Raise the Age. And I also want to just emphasize that as a division, we are very committed to Raise the Age, and we understand the science behind it and the intent, and we absolutely are still seeking to continue to implement the act, even though there have been challenges. And I know that what we're supposed to be talking about today are basically giving a status report in terms of what's been done thus far and what needs to be done. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and move directly into our presentation. So Tyler, can you start me off at slide 2?
you want to put that on the screen?
Can you move to the second one for me? Thanks. So in 2019, DCF, with the support of Columbia Justice Lab's Emerging Adult Justice Project, released the Act 201 Implementation Plan Report. I want to note that DCF definitely met regularly with the Juvenile Justice Stakeholders Group throughout the duration of the implementation of the Act, and that much of the work that will be described today was accomplished as part of that collaboration. The initial implementation plan report provided substantial evidence in support of expanding the age range of juvenile jurisdiction beyond the age of 18. The report also identified values that form the foundation of Raise the Age and several well-founded strategies to support it. These strategies are varied. They extend beyond just DCF and are closely related to all the juvenile justice systems and supports. The first annual status report from 2020 that we supplied identified 3 general areas of need for successful implementation. Supports for secure placement facilities at the highest end of the system of care, workforce supports, and ongoing data collection and evaluation of capacity expansion. These do continue to be areas of an identified need for the division. And so here, this slide provides examples of recommendations contained in the implementation report: enhancement of diversion practices, maximizing within FSD, expansion of non-custodial post-merits, developing DCF's operational capacity, defining and developing data collection and analysis processes, and identifying statutory changes. Progress has definitely been made on aspects of each of these recommendations, but some elements do fall outside DCF's locus of control. Some require additional resources, and others are ongoing efforts. Moreover, all of these efforts have significantly been impacted by the effects of the pandemic.
Can I don't want to break in, but I do want, before the commissioner has to leave, are there any proposals? Were there proposals in the 2022 fiscal year budget to deal with any of these needs in terms of resources?
Yes, there was.
That we missed. I mean, I was trying to think back to our budget deliberations and I can't remember.
Yes, and particularly to Raise the Age specifically, we had a request in the 21 BAA, and which then carried over as a base into the 22 build to develop some programming for Raise the Age. I think it was approximately $500,000, if my memory is right. I don't have that in front of me. We have utilized those dollars to contract with a provider in Central Vermont to provide some intense residential services programming. Also, we're negotiating with a provider in the southern area of the state to do some transitional housing with some support services as well. And then we're also exploring what opportunities might be available in the northern part of the state as well with those dollars. In addition, obviously, we're still working through proposals for the upcoming budget year as well. And I certainly can't go into detail there, but certainly.
No, I understand that.
Yep.
It would be helpful at some point we could get a list of what the requests were in the Budget Adjustment Act. And you know, I don't know if you can talk about this year's Budget Adjustment Act, but if there's need for more, keep us in mind.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you,
And,
Commissioners.
and
Sorry for the interruption.
oh, no, not at all, Senator. And actually, a little bit lower in the presentation, I can tell you some more about those initiatives and what we were trying to do with the housing. So we're talking about the impact of COVID and how it's impacted Raise the Age. It's definitely severely impacted many of the residential programs that we rely on. It's caused staffing shortages, service interruptions, and reduced capacity, which really has caused a lack of stability in the system of care in general, not simply for our division. The courts were affected as well. The courts have had to operate on reduced schedule, which has contributed to backlogs around emergency placements. Our system partners and providers have had to adjust approaches and protocols and practices in order to reduce transmission of the virus as well. And in addition to COVID, there have been some other unintended challenges related to implementing Raise the Age. For example, while the objectives of the Family First Prevention Services Act, also known as FFPSA, are consistent with Raise the Age, coordinating both of these initiatives simultaneously have definitely been challenging, especially given that certain parts of the FFPSA will require new judicial proceedings. There's also new federal compliance mandates coming, I believe, beginning in December that are going to impact where and how youth may be held securely. And these mandates will also require additional judicial proceedings. Another matter is that the courts are transitioning between data systems, and that impacts our access to reporting data, which has resulted in some of the systems that had been automated that now need to be managed manually, which of course causes time delays and more pressures for our workforce. Also, DCF's programs, they've been developed to support an under age 18 population, and resource providers have not yet had the capacity or time really to consider how to expand these resources to a new population. But I was listening to the presentation earlier this morning, and I was really interested to hear that sometimes when you have programming for individuals that are 17, you really also do have programming then for individuals that are 18, perhaps just with some tweaks or adjustments. So hopefully then there will not be a very difficult transition for these programs in order to help the youth that are emerging adults age 18 and over. And lastly, there have been some data trends that have shown a shifting in DCF's juvenile justice population. And the next slide will illustrate some of the shift. So DCF's data, if you take a look at the charts, it indicates that while delinquent youths in custody has trended downward, the numbers of pre and post dispositional youth have steadily increased. And this is suggestive of an increase in the number of youth being served under the youthful offender status, thereby indicating a shift in our juvenile justice population from delinquency cases to YO cases. A dramatic uptick in the number of YO court filings occurred in 2019. And notably, not all these filings are distinct cases, but that were granted youthful offender status. But it's important to note that each of these cases still did require an increased workload for DCF staff, as well as our contracted partners, such as writing reports for court and also attending court hearings.
I'm hoping to be able to separate the two different bills. I know they get kind of, you know, you're stuck dealing with both the YOs and the 18-year-olds. But I'm hoping to separate in terms of our discussions of changes that are needed to the YO law, but I'm struck by the numbers, if I'm reading them correctly, going from
Yeah.
44 in FY15 up to 301 last year.
Yeah.
There's some kind of a blip at 504 in FY19, but
Yeah.
still, that's a lot of kids.
It is, and it's definitely created a substantial impact on the workforce. And I do have to caution that, the numbers in 2020 are sort of wonky because of COVID, and it's really hard to get a reliable sense of really what's going on with those numbers. But the upward trend is definitely clear.
Well, the law changed in 2018, which you would have seen in FY19. That was a major change to the YO law. But we'll try to get into that. I'm gonna, at the next meeting, I'm gonna have Eric kind of go through the differences between the two laws. There's confusion amongst the general public, but also even confusion amongst law enforcement and others.
And you're right, and that confusion tends to make it, well, you're making the problem appear larger than what it really is if you're combining those two populations, because they are distinct. We have to handle both of them and understand the distinction. But you're right, when I see things in the paper or certain numbers that are misquoted, it's clear that they are sort of combining the two. So I know that we were also wanted to talk about what's been done. And this slide is starting to talk about, implementation of juvenile justice reform in general. And it does touch on the what was done with the funds that we were given that the commissioner mentioned. So DCF has been deeply involved in implementing several juvenile justice reforms last year, and many of them, which I was really happy to know, have allowed us to collaborate with residential programs, other state agencies, the Juvenile Justice Stakeholders Group, and also educational institutions. For example, DCF partnered with DOC to secure 7 beds in a program that DOC had been working with for some time. The 2 of these beds can be used for emergency placement, and this placement is in a staff supervised setting, and it's located in central Vermont. We've already had 2 individuals with youthful offender status reside at the program, and we've been very satisfied with the work the programs have been doing. DCF is also in the process of expanding a contract with the program in the southern part of the state to secure 3 beds and 2 apartments for more of an independent style transitional living setting. Because what we're looking to do with this population is have a layered array of programming so that you can go from, more of the secure residences to something far more open and transitional living settings for those that are emerging adults and getting ready to move out on their own. We've also worked with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. They've been a great partner to develop a curriculum to support pre-charge response for youths who've had hunting and fishing violations. And of course, the Juvenile Justice Stakeholder Group, we work with them along with state agency partners to work through a number of statutory concerns, issues that required statutory amendments, including those that were included in the miscellaneous judicial bill that was this past spring. A real exciting thing that I was able to be involved in was we worked with the Vermont Law School to support sending 8 FSD and barge workers to enroll in a restorative justice certificate program. The program is a 3-course, 9-credit offering. It's supposed to take no more than 2 years to complete. And it provides an opportunity to learn and understand about restorative justice responses to harm and how to use restorative dialogue to teach families how to better interact and engage with each other and the community. And this is just really a great opportunity for our workers to dig into restorative justice and apply it to the families, not only in the juvenile justice area, but also in our child welfare arena as well. The first session of the certificate program begins next semester. In terms of education, we also partnered with the Health, Education, and Training Institute in Portland, Maine, to offer FSD and BARD staff motivational interviewing training. Motivational interviewing is a collaborative and compassionate conversation style. It's aimed at strengthening a youth's motivation to develop inner resiliency. This mode of interviewing, it can also enhance the provider's skill that will lead to better outcomes for youth. And the neat thing here is that what we're going to do is send people to training, and then they're going to come back and do it like each one teach one, so that we'll have these trainers come back and impart this skill set to the rest of our FSD workforce. And that training became available in September. And finally, we have also worked on several CFCPP funded juvenile justice initiatives as well. One of them was involving validation and assessment for YASI. The council approved spending about a little over $60,000 to support the validation and ethnic and racial disparity assessments of YASI. The study will examine how YASI performs for different subgroups like gender and race, and also different client types. And it's possible that this analysis could result in recommendations to change the scoring methodology for the tool.
Given Lael Chester's some report and her comments regarding risk assessment tools having some bias in them, I think this is really good, but maybe you could go in a little more detail about what this will involve, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. And you're right that I think that was the primary purpose for partnering with the council, was to determine whether or not there was that type of bias and whether or not we would be able to address that and sort of change the scoring methodology. But I would ask Tyler, Tyler, can you talk a little bit more about what exactly we're looking to do in terms of validation with YASI?
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Erica, and thanks to the committee for having me here today. So this particular effort it started out as something that you have to do along with the course of administering risk and needs assessment, typically and traditionally, which is to make sure that it is validated to your jurisdictional population. There was initial validation study at implementation time. And now that we have 5 years or several years of data associated with that, the idea was to say, is our application of the tool still valid? So there was already a plan to validate the tool as we've been using it. At the same time, I think we began to ask important questions around this tool's impact on the likelihood of disproportionality. Is it identifying youths of color as being at higher level of risk, higher level of danger? And when we looked into our data, we did find to some degree there was a variance, particularly Black youth are identified at higher risk because primarily of legal concerns. So these are static factors attached to them. And so we took that back to the tool developer and we asked them if there was a way we could make an adjustment so that we are considerate of the fact of that disproportionality. But to read the findings of the tool would invalidate the function of the tool. And so what they did was they pointed us to some work that was done in New York, which is has them altering the cut points to determine at what point do you say something is low versus medium versus high risk. And what you can do is you can shift where you put those cut points. And in New York, what they found was that it dramatically changed who the tool was identifying. It brought alignment in terms of disproportional use. Now, I will preface this whole idea or this whole section of conversation. The point that New York got to after making these changes, I think, is still a little bit more disparate than where Vermont is starting from, because our tool hasn't been attached to significant disproportionality, but it doesn't mean we want to leave those efforts alone. So our idea is, along with this validation study, to also include stakeholder groups in some strategies around shifting cut points and what those could look like. And that would be followed by a future validation study. Once Vermont has enough data, it'll take Vermont several years, because our numbers are relatively small, to get enough data for a statistically significant finding. But we want to make sure we're kind of progressing that initiative. So I hope that answers your question, Senator.
Well, it does to some extent. There was some concern expressed, and I hope I don't have the wrong risk assessments here. But there was a concern expressed a while back at some meeting I attended that the YASI did not provide adequate look at sex offenders. Is that the case? Or am I mixing?
Yeah, the tool is not validated to measure in that, and there's a separate tool that's used by DOC. So in youthful offender cases, I think it's called the Static 99. I'm not sure of the tool name they're able to use, but when we have a case that there's a sex offense, they administer another tool.
Thank you. I was right. Well,
Yeah.
I don't know why I remember things like that, and I can't remember what I had for dinner last night.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
So I'm a little confused here about when Layla was talking with us, the notes that I made were that risk assessments were unreliable, and that risk assessment measures the dangerousness test, and that we shouldn't be, what I got from her was that isn't we shouldn't necessarily be using them on youth. But she did talk about YASI, which she said is a needs assessment, but you're using the word risk assessment in relationship to YASI. So I'm confused here. So is there a risk assessment that's different than a needs assessment? And do we use both? And is a risk assessment assessing the dangerousness of the person? And is that reliable to be used with youth, whether or not there's racial inequities in it?
For here, we're using YASI more in terms of assessing the possibility of reoffending, in terms of recidivism, not in terms of dangerousness. There are other assessment tools that are out there, but for us, we're using YASI in this context. Tyler, would you want to add to that?
Could I just, so when you say risk of reoffense, not.
Exactly.
Okay, I don't know if that answers my concern or not, because that was what I thought that she was saying was not reliable to use on youth because of the immaturity of their brains and how they change so fast that they may be at a high risk of reoffending at age 18 and a half, but by the time they're 22. Anyway.
If I just may add to the content, that is, your read on this is correct, Senator. YASI is a tool. It's both a risk and needs assessment. It measures risk to recidivism, so risk of reoffense specifically. And dangerousness as a concept is probably something that would need further definition before you could talk about what sort of tools could describe that. But the YASI as it is both, in my estimation, is both a risk assessment and needs assessment, and it is used for determining, the best services needed for a population, along with the risk to concern. So it's why that tool has been used to great success.
Okay, that I don't think answers my concern. It answers my question, but not my concern.
Okay, thank you. You want to go on, or was Deputy Commissioner
Sure.
Radke? I've
Okay.
interrupted somewhere here now. Back to, I think we're at the Emerging Adult Domestic Violence Intervention Program.
Exactly. Thank you, Senator. Domestic violence charges involving juveniles under the age of 18 in Vermont are typically based on acts of violence against family members. But with the 18 and 19-year-old population, however, the alleged victims are usually an intimate partner. So the council selected Bennington College to identify and evaluate a group of existing effective domestic violence intervention programs in order to provide recommendations as to which Vermont could use in order to build its own intervention program. Bennington will submit in its evaluation of the programs later this month and issue a final report with recommendations by July 2022. In terms of recidivism, last year the council and DCF began a contract with the Crime Research Lab to evaluate recidivism rates of 18 and 19-year-olds who were adjudicated in adult court prior to July 1st, 2020. And this measure would provide a benchmark that would allow Vermont to compare the recidivism rate for this population when criminal charges are processed in adult court to the recidivism rate for the same population when similar charges are processed in juvenile court. And of course, this is definitely the type of information that we're looking for, that we're deeply interested in seeing, because of course, other studies have shown that when emerging adults are placed in the juvenile justice system as opposed to the criminal system, recidivism rates are much lower. So we're looking to see basically if that's borne out. CRG's final report is due in July 2022. In terms of school discipline, an RFP to implement a school-based community response that addresses the systemic and institutionalized racism within the school system as a way to address the disproportionate arrests of youth of color was issued and awarded in 2020. The two grantees were the Burlington School District and Spectrum Youth and Family Services. These grantees are developing strategies. It's really interesting. These strategies they're looking to use are avoiding the punitive measures that have been used in the past that will perpetuate the problem. And instead, they're looking at programs and interventions to address the root cause of student behavior and to provide needed services both on and off school grounds as an approach to reducing Vermont's ethnic and racial disparities in arrests. And finally, we're also looking at training law enforcement on diversion. The council posted an RFP for a sub-recipient to provide law enforcement entities training on restorative justice best practices and the benefits of pre-charge restorative justice alternatives for juveniles and young adults up to the age of 22. The training is to be designed to increase pre and post-charge referrals and decrease racial and ethnic inequities in these referrals. The DCF is currently working to execute this contract with an anticipated start date of October 15th, 2021. So that's the end of our prepared comments. We just want to give you an overview of where we are right now in terms of how we are implementing the Raise the Age initiatives, really pushing it forward, and also where there are still areas of need. And Tyler and I would be happy to answer any questions you have at this time.
I'm going to start out by thanking you first for the presentation and the helpfulness of it, but also for doing, even moving forward in a little bit on school discipline. As Senator Bruce knows, when he was chair of the Senate Education Committee, I was constantly trying to look at ways to provide school discipline that didn't involve expulsion or suspension, because to me, for a troubled youth, nothing worse than sending them out of school, maybe in one place where they have any structure in their life. And it's just so counterintuitive. So thank you for, no matter how small or how big that effort is, I'm glad to see something on school discipline in there. And it's a critical area. So I would start with that anyway.
No, it really is. And I like that the approach that they're using, because it falls away from those old approaches that really exacerbated the racial and ethnic disparities when there's such a heavy-handed approach, as opposed to more of a restorative justice approach, a collaborative approach, where you're really pulling in the community and services and trying to look at what's behind the behavior.
Appreciate that. Questions or other comments about where we're at with this implementation? Anyone? One of the implementation reports, going from the executive summary now, was ensuring a full continuum of post-dispositional options. It's more than important forever juvenile justice system to have a full continuum of post-disposition options once 18 and 19-year-olds are included in the juvenile justice system. Would you say that, in your progress report, you talked a little bit about some of them, but have the major problems been with any kind of residential program because of COVID? Would that be inaccurate?
Erica, would you like?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure of the question. I didn't understand.
Well, I guess the question is the implementation report from November 1 of 2019, among other things, said ensuring a full continuum of post-dispositional options, which would include residential, diversion, so that we're proportionately responding to law-breaking behavior. And my question was, COVID has stalled your efforts? Would it be accurate to say COVID has stalled the effort to try to find residential alternatives?
Oh, 100%. COVID has really impacted the programs. I mean, we are working with programs that have reduced capacity. A lot of it is driven by a lack of staff. Some of it has lately been driven by COVID being in the program, so then they're not able to take referrals. Sometimes they can have reduced capacity where they'll be able to take referrals maybe during the week, but not on the weekend. And some of the programs have actually had to close portions of it down. So it's impacted it tremendously. Tyler, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, if I may add a little content also if we step back and we kind of look at direct and indirect impact. I think Erica really nicely described what some of that indirect impact is. But if I think about it from a residential perspective, I think we mentioned in a slide that staffing, which is a national issue, staffing programs like this. I recently got off a leadership committee with folks from all around the country, and every single person had identified that I heard had identified that staffing programs is a national challenge right now, and we certainly see that happening in many of our residential programs. And so the question that comes up to me is, if the programs are struggling to have adequate staff to maintain full bed capacity, when then I reach out to them and say, could you create a program that supports an 18 or 19-year-old population? Well, I appreciate Lael's perspective, and from a values perspective, I agree with that. The programs also have to have an understanding that they'd be willing to do that. And so for them, they're saying, you're asking me to develop new programs, a new population, a new something or other, but I don't have the staffing to maintain my current population. So I simply can't do that. So it's in some ways, it's not a question of if I could just have a little bit more money that I could offer them, it would fix the problem, because they don't have the bandwidth to create the programming that we're asking to do. So I think that's one of the also overarching challenges associated.
Senator White.
So, Erica, I was taken by your comment about the certificate program with the Vermont Law School. And when I think that I misunderstood it when you were first talking about it. And so my question is, and this may be a little far afield, but is the certificate program designed for current professionals, or is it designed also for people? I'm thinking about a lot of the 18, 19-year-olds who we're talking about are people who don't have a path ahead of them for a trade or a skill or education. And I'm thinking that something like that, there are people out there who might be very good taking that, and a 19-year-old taking that certificate course or other certificate courses. And I just wondered if you have had any conversations with, and I know that I'm doing the same thing here that Tyler just said, we shouldn't be asking our providers to do new things, but with DOL or Agency of Education around providing specific training programs or certificate programs that maybe are already in the works, but a better path for these kids to go into those.
That's a wonderful idea. No, that hadn't been the direction we were going in. We were working with Bobby Sand in terms of having this program for entry-level and mid-level professionals, and they could use the 9 credits to go toward an associate's degree. And in terms of teaching these practices for taking it back for maybe even youths in foster care or juvenile justice settings where maybe the youth has created harm, and how they can do some type of restitution more in the restorative process, and also including the victims who often don't get a voice in terms of what they would like to do in terms of restoring what's been happening, what had happened to them in order to address their issue. But I like the idea of perhaps bringing in the population we serve, because some of them, of course, have been involved in these types of issues, and to have that lens, not simply as a consumer, but more as an instructor, I think would be empowering for other people that they may encounter that have had these problems. So I haven't reached out to DOL, but you really put an idea in my head to try. I mean, yes, everybody is limited in terms of staff, but I think that would be great.
Thank you.
Well, the auditor just did a report on the WIOA.
Yeah.
And that's a place to use. It's got the money, it just needs the right.
May I add a thought to that?
Sure.
I'd just like to add that this program was designed for graduate. It's a graduate program. and I think Director Ecke was speaking to that, but or sorry, Deputy Commissioner, my boss. But it's designed that way, and that the intended impact here is to develop kind of the culture of restorative practice among professionals. I see this as one of those opportunity. It's kind of like a drop of dye in the bucket of water where you hope it spreads out more and more. So I think there's lots of areas for growth that can be attached to the beginning of this initiative.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further questions or comments? Tyler and Deputy Commissioner Radke, thank you so much for the presentation. It's very helpful to get a sense of where we're at, some of the challenges. I think the one final question I have is regarding the court backlog, and nobody knows, obviously, what'll happen. But any inklings you have on how that might impact your system would be welcome at either today or at a future date when we just continue to discuss this. I just am fearful that when the spigot opens, we're going to see this tremendous onrush of people, both in the adult and the juvenile systems.
It is definitely a concern, and it's hard because we have the backlog and we also have initiatives that have additional pieces that have that have mandated court hearings as well. And I'm hopeful, though, that we can work together with the judiciary to come up with some ideas on how to address it so that we can get the needs met of the youth in our custody sooner rather than later. But it is a challenge that's looming.
And I, as a member, well, either fortunately or unfortunately, I'm also a member of the Joint Child Protection Committee. And we had quite a presentation on the Families First, which also will exacerbate this. There's a lot going on, let's put it that way. So why don't we break for lunch, come back at 12:30, and we're going to hear from Jay Johnson, Commissioner, and Commissioner Brown, Commissioner Sherling, and Jennifer Frank from the Vermont Association of Chiefs of Police when we get back on some concerns, changes, whatever. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you at 12:30.
Thank you for the opportunity to